Hi everybody. So a wee series of videos here on the Slab Boys and the requirements of the Scottish set text paper, which I've just kind of put together into the one little series for you. So this first video, just going to have a look at the sort of general context, quick look at the characters, and a wee quick look at the plot as well. So, the context of the Slab Boys, it's set in what they call the slab room, which is the room in which the paint gets made, basically gets mixed up in a carpet factory in Paisley in a single day, winter 1957, on a Friday, end of the week, end of the working week, obviously. It's therefore set within a sort of an interesting period in Scottish history. This is still, working class manufacturing stuff in Scotland. Factories, that kind of labour sort of driving the economy, driving people's lives. But it's important to understand that it's been set in a period of, as I kind of put in the video there, sort of emerging change, in a social and cultural sense. These are the years right before the 60s, right before, which is the period that we associate with the sort of massive cultural changes. But the 50s are an interesting period because, for example, of what is effectively the emergence of the idea of the teenager. If you look at Phil and Spanky in particular and how different they are compared to the generation above. Little things even like the James Dean poster being up on the wall and not needing to have like a name on it or anything like that. James Dean representing this idea of the rebel without the cause, that sort of teenage rebellion idea. So we're set in a Scotland that is still very much the sort of the old Scotland, that kind of old industrial Scotland. We are looking at people working in a very, very industrial environment in one of the old carpet factories in Paisley, which incidentally is where the author, the sort of place the author worked as well. But remember, emerging sort of social changes in terms of cultural, social things which led to the sorts of big changes that we saw in the 60s, but that started in the 50s with things like the emergence of this idea of teenagers and this sort of rebellion of that generation against the expectation and the demands of previous generations. It was the point in which, in many, many ways, society really shifted after the war. Characters, so not all that many actually, and for each character I would very much recommend that you have a set of notes. Now they'll be more extensive the higher up this list you are, clearly, because there's more and more of them involved. But a wee quick summary of them. Phil McCann's your main character. Want to ask what kind of person is he? It's quite difficult. He's certainly very bold, might be the word you would use, but I think that's probably a little bit soft. Very, very talented, very clever, very hard working as well in some cases. I mean, we see a lot about him being lazy in work, but that portfolio that he's made takes a huge amount of work. Difficult home situation as well, a complicated character, and the kind of character that benefits from multiple readings of the play where you're looking exclusively at how his character develops and how we're helped to understand more and more about him, not just by the things that he says and does, but by the things that other people say and how they react towards him. You've got his pal Spanky. Different kind of character, still part of how and Phil have got this kind of double act going. They are pretty merciless about it a lot of the time, but Spanky isn't the same kind of person as Phil. And one of the things to look at, for example, is the way in which Spanky interacts with other people when Phil is and is not in the room. But both Phil and Spanky are, young working class guys in this job, which in theory is, this kind of entry level job, but to them certainly feels fairly dead end. Something represented in a lot of ways, the tiny wee room, the fact it's only got one exit, etc., etc. You've got Hector, who I think is best described as a student a couple of years ago, who just said, what's Hector? He just said he's a poor soul, which is fair enough. Hector is very, very naive. If you read the second play, I know we're not studying that strictly speaking, but if you read the second play in the series in the book that you've got, you'll understand more about Hector. But there are issues that are alluded to and sort of talked about with Hector in the play as well. Suicide attempts. There's obviously that naivety seems to go a little bit further than just somebody who's just a wee bit naive. There's maybe more of an issue an underlying issue with Hector, and he's the sort of the butt of jokes all the way through. He's the butt of the kind of physical comedy jokes, and when he's getting the makeover done, reappears covered in blood at the window and stuff like that. But there is the bit where they're talking about how to Phil and Spanky, treating him this way is about kind of making him feel part of the gang, I suppose, or something like that. You can decide for yourself the extent to which that is genuine, though. Alan Downey is the very obviously very well off guy who rocks up in the slab room. He is, he's going to go to uni. He's clearly a different kind of person. We find out early on he's getting paid more than all the others put together. One of the things, again, Alan's one of these guys who benefits from rereading the play, just focusing on him, just looking at his character and his personality, because a lot of the time people read through the play just once and you kind of get this feeling, oh well, it's not his fault, he's middle class, he seems quite a good guy. But if you kind of look through, there are various things where what you see is maybe not necessarily a bad person in particular, but certainly someone quite detached from the reality of the world that they're now in. Look at the reaction to the bit about him getting paid more than everybody else, and then when he basically says, oh well, my wee brother's getting paid more than this, is it really an awful lot of money? It's a really insensitive thing to say in front of people who are being paid an awful lot less than you. He just doesn't seem to get it. Look at the way that he talks to Phil at the end. Admittedly, he's got reason by then to not be Phil's biggest fan, but not quite the clear cut, he's just there, it's not his fault, victim of circumstance kind of thing. There's more to his character than that, but he exists as a contrast. He exists to contrast to Phil and to help you understand things like the impact of social class and the difference in opportunities that people are going to get in life. You've got Lucille Bentley. She is, every slab boy's dream. She's gorgeous, but she's also formidable. She doesn't take any of their nonsense. When she's in the room with them, she feels that she's in charge. There's one of the really good bits for understanding Lucille is the conversation with Sadie about men. Lucille is very much of the same generation as Phil and Spanky. Doesn't feel the need to be sort of tied into previous generations' expectations of life. Certainly doesn't accept Sadie's expectations of men and what women can expect from them. So an interesting character in several ways in that regard. Sort of represents changing views of women in some ways as well, although in the 50s that's very much right at the start of that process. The boss, Curry. Again, an interesting character. You kind of get the feeling he probably comes from a similar-ish kind of background to Phil and Spanky. He doesn't come across as somebody who's more like Alan. He talks at points about things that he's done in the past. We get things about the military service, which gets sort of obliterated by Phil at the end. He talks about having gone to Saturday classes at the art school. He seems very, very interested in being respected. He wants Phil and Spanky to respect him in his position, which probably suggests somebody who's worked their way up and now feels like they're entitled to that kind of respect from people who haven't done that yet. But again, interesting character, particularly towards the end, because when Phil starts having a go at him after he's been fired, you couldn't wait to get rid of me, the reaction's very, very different. Starts telling Phil, actually, I tried to help you, I tried to save your job, but he wasn't having it, despite everything, even over the course of that one day, even that Phil's done to him and the way Phil's spoken to him. So again, a more complex character than he probably seems at first. Sadie's a relatively minor character, but when she again represents kind of this thing about generational shift in a lot of ways. Look at the difference between her and Lucille. Look at the way that she's seen by the boys, because as much as I'm saying there are changing views of women sort of visible at points in this play, at the same time we only have two female characters. One of them's a mother character and one of them's a sex symbol. So it's worth keeping that in mind as well. But have a look at what Sadie's really useful as a character when she's talking about her expectations, the life that she has sort of outside the slab, and talks about her husband. That's the stuff that's worth looking at for Sadie to help understand. A question that's come up before has been like the role of women. Things like that are important to understand how they are presented and the sort of role that they play in the drama. And then finally, I regard him as a very, very minor character, but you've got Jack Hogg. He's the guy who's gone from the slab room into the design room. The thing that Hector then goes on to do. Again, probably overly focused on being respected. thinks that because he's got that position that the Slab Boys are therefore supposed to respect him and look up to him and stuff like that. You see the way that he fawns over Alan though as well. This doesn't strike me as somebody who's hugely confident in themselves, and there's still that kind of class thing going on as well, that kind of deference side of things. So each character quite different, and the way they interact is important, but I would recommend a set of notes on each individual character. Not only because you could in theory be asked about an individual character in the exam, but also because if you can put together these different aspects of each character, do things like, you know, character focused readings of the play and things like that, you'll find it an awful lot easier to connect the characters to the themes. And that's the really important thing you need to do maybe later on. If you're going to talk about themes, you're going to have to tell us how they manifest, and the way they're going to manifest is obviously through characters. So you need to be able to make those connections. Finally, you need a good sense of the plot. Now, I'm not going to read all this through to you because it's a video and you can read it by yourself. And this isn't the way it must be done or anything like that. There are different ways that you could phrase all this. Maybe there are slightly different bits that you think are critical, but this is my kind of 10-point plot summary that I've chucked together. Again, it's one of these things. It's important to have this because you need to be able to think through and locate different events at the right part in the play. If you're going to connect them to characters and to themes, then you need to at least be able to tell us, you know, where things happen. And if you don't have a clear sense of the plot, then trust me, it's extremely difficult, if not impossible, to answer the sort of general questions like the question at the end of the paper on things like themes and the sort of big conceptual ideas that are explored in the play. It seems something really basic and really simple, but seriously, make sure you learn a good, nice, clear plot summary. Whether you write it out as a list of bullet points, whether you do it as like I sometimes get students to do it on A3 sheet of paper and do it as an actual timeline. It doesn't really matter as long as it gets done. Okay, so a wee bit longer than I expected, but the basic bits of the play covered there. Any questions, give me a shout, and the next couple of videos I'll look through some of the slightly more complex or sophisticated aspects of the text. Cheers.